Before we begin, subscribe so you never miss another sleepless night. Now, let's begin. I grew up on the outskirts of Millfield, a tiny town hemmed in by forest and dirt roads. My parents built our 2-story house there when my mother was pregnant with me, and my childhood was filled with morning walks along the rutted path that served as our driveway. It took nearly 15 minutes just to reach the county road to catch the bus, and in winter, the overhanging branches glistened with ice. My father worked nights, so the early morning was often just me and the birdsong. One chilly September morning, a beat-up silver Toyota blocked that trail. Inside sat a thin, tired-looking woman with stringy hair who watched me in a way that made my skin crawl. Her eyes tracked me like she knew exactly who I was. My parents dismissed it as someone lost until I encountered her again a week later in the same spot. This time she followed me into the trees, calling my full name as though she knew me intimately. Terrified, I raced home, heart pounding, breath frosting in the cool air. That evening, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and told me about Marissa, his first wife. He spoke in a quiet voice I'd never heard before. She'd struggled with mental illness and vanished decades earlier after promising to take something of his when she came back. He thought she had moved states away, perhaps found help. Over the following days, she lingered near our property, turning up outside the high school fence during soccer practice, standing in the tree line at dusk, tapping on my second-story window in the middle of the night. She sang my name softly like it was a lullaby. The police were called repeatedly but could do little without a clear threat. Eventually, she simply stopped showing up. Maybe the restraining order we filed reached her. Maybe winter drove her away. Or maybe she found another life. I never saw her again, though once I spotted a newspaper clipping about a woman found wandering in a nearby county and wondered. My parents never found out what became of her. Even now, years later, the sound of leaves crunching behind me in the woods makes me quicken my pace. Her soft, sing-song voice still echoes in my head, saying my name like a promise I hope she never keeps. Living alone had always felt like a blessing. My small 2-bedroom house in quiet Wilmont, Pennsylvania served as both my home and office. I spent most days editing video projects and looking out over the front yard for a break. On crisp October afternoons when the leaves turned amber, I'd make coffee and sit at my upstairs window, feeling content in my solitude. That sense of calm shattered one afternoon when I noticed a stranger at the foot of my driveway. He wasn't passing by or walking a dog. He just stood there in a gray hoodie, staring up at my window as if watching a movie. He came back the next day, and then again. Each time, his presence stretched into minutes that felt like hours. A note appeared on my door, telling me by name to answer. The handwriting was neat, almost polite. Later, a photograph of me, shot through my own window, was stuck in the soil near the street. My heart pounded as I realized someone had been close enough to photograph me without my knowledge. I told my sister and then the police, but there wasn't much they could do, since the man never actually trespassed. Nighttime became torture. There would be gentle, patient knocks on my front door at 2 a.m, always a soft tapping that never escalated to pounding. Once, the motion sensor on the new cameras I installed alerted me to his presence, and I watched on my phone as he lifted a sign to the lens that read, "Let me in." He never spoke. He communicated through gestures and props, as if we had some unspoken agreement. My nerves frayed until a detective suggested I go stay somewhere else. My sister drove 2 hours in the rain to collect me that night. I spent a month at her apartment in the city, sleeping on her couch and jumping at every elevator ding. When I finally came back, the man was gone. My lawn was overgrown, and the cameras recorded nothing but squirrels. Still, nearly a year later, every time I sit at my upstairs desk, I glance toward the driveway and brace myself. The worst part is not knowing if he's truly disappeared or if he's waiting for the right moment to return. Life goes on. I edit, I cook, I invite friends over, but the shadow of a gray hoodie remains at the edge of my vision. In Stonebridge, the Davenports next door were like family. Their daughter, Maris, and I were inseparable, especially during lazy summer days spent skipping stones at the creek and playing tag until the porch lights came on. One July afternoon, I was lounging in our yard flipping through a magazine when an unfamiliar man pulled into their driveway in a battered police uniform. His belt held a taser and radio, but there was no badge on his chest, and his cruiser looked like an old sedan with decals. Alarm bells rang, so I texted Maris's parents and watched him peer into their windows before hurrying back to his car when he saw me watching. The sheriff later confirmed no officers should have been there. Not long after, my family vacationed at a posh resort miles away on Lake Marion. The place had marble floors and soft jazz in the lobby. It felt worlds removed from our small town. In the hotel elevator, I found myself alone with the same man, now dressed in plain clothes. Recognition set in slowly. He smiled with his mouth closed and stood just a foot too close. He followed me off on my floor, matching my pace down the corridor as my heart pounded. Sensing danger, I pretended to have forgotten my room number and bolted down the hall, sprinting to my room, slamming the door and throwing the chain. Immediately, the phone rang. A calm male voice told me I was beautiful and recited my full name, proving he somehow knew who I was and where I was staying. My father's arrival on the line scared him off, but I spent the rest of the trip hiding behind my parents in crowded hallways and scanning the lobby for his face. Even now, a decade later, unknown numbers and lonely hotel hallways make my skin crawl. Whoever he was never caught. Sometimes, when my phone rings late at night, or when I step into an elevator and see a stranger, I wonder if he's somewhere nearby, reminding me that I was never completely out of his sight. The world can feel vast, yet under the gaze of a single person, it shrinks into a trap. At 24, I moved to the rural town of Millstone for a steady paycheck at the only supermarket. It wasn't glamorous, but it covered my rent for a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a view of the alley. I stocked shelves, cleaned spills, and smiled at customers. Most nights, I closed the store alone, mopping aisles under the hum of fluorescent lights. One regular stuck out. A gaunt man in his 30s who would wander in just before 10, purchase a few items, and leave without small talk. He never smiled, never made eye contact, but I learned the cadence of his footsteps on the tile. One evening I noticed him standing by his car when my shift ended. He didn't leave. When I got home that night, strange things started happening. A bright sweep of headlights cut through my bedroom, blinds around midnight, even though I lived at the end of a dead-end street. Later, I woke to find my bedroom door slightly ajar even though I always shut it, and the smell of stale cologne lingered in the hall. Peering toward the closet, I met an eye peering back at me through the crack. Panic propelled me outside half-dressed and across the street to a neighbor's house to call the police. The authorities searched my apartment and found an old flip phone and a jacket in my closet. It belonged to Aaron Miles, the quiet late-night customer. On his phone were grainy photos of me leaving work, sitting on my couch, brushing my teeth. He had been watching me for weeks, slipping into my apartment while I was at work by using a bent card to jimmy the lock. They arrested him and said the only reason I might still be here is because the buzz of his phone had woken me before he could do anything. My landlord replaced my locks, and I moved away soon after, packing my life into a borrowed van and leaving in the middle of the day so no one would watch me load boxes. In Millstone, gossip travels quickly. Some people said I overreacted. Others whispered about the crazy stalker. All I know is that I still check my closets before I go to bed. Monsters sometimes hide in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone to let their guard down, and sometimes the scariest part is realizing you can't always see them until it's almost too late. At 16, I took to skipping school by riding city buses to kill time. My parents worked long hours, and the bus routes felt like a rolling movie of the town, each stop a new scene. One chilly October morning, I hopped on the nearly empty number 47, choosing a seat near the middle and watching rain beat on the windows. Midway through the route, a middle-aged man boarded. He smelled of sweat and stale liquor, ignored the driver's greeting, and collapsed across from me. Pulling a bottle of whiskey from his filthy rucksack, he took a long swig and then tried to make me drink, as though we were old friends. When I refused, he muttered to himself incoherently, his red eyes flicking between the other passengers and me. The bus jolted over potholes, and I counted the stops until the shopping center, the only place I knew well enough to navigate. As the bus rolled into the shopping center, I grabbed my bag and stood to leave. He clamped his clammy hand around mine, his fingernails digging into my skin, tightening until the driver finally shouted and he let go, laughing hoarsely like it was a game. I fled into the mall restroom, shaking, splashing cold water on my face. When I later glanced over the balcony, he was still there, scanning the crowd until he spotted me. Our eyes met and he smiled. Weaving through the shops, I managed to lose him and catch a bus home. I never told anyone. Part of me felt foolish for skipping school. Part of me feared my parents would forbid me from leaving the house again. Afterwards, I took fewer buses and sat closer to the driver when I did, headphones in but senses on high alert. Looking back, I realized how alone I felt on that bus, even though there were other passengers. No one intervened until the driver raised his voice. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they thought it wasn't their business. That indifference scared me almost as much as the man's grip. In college, I took a self-defense class and began carrying a whistle. I also learned to speak up when I saw someone else being harassed, because silence only emboldens predators. Sometimes, fear isn't about what actually happens, but about the realization of how close you came to something far worse. Years later, whenever I see someone drunk and aggressive on public transit, my hand still tingles where he grabbed me. When I was 7, my parents took my sister and me into the city for lunch. They wanted to expose us to different foods and bustling streets. I disliked the crowds and held back while they read menus posted outside restaurants, dragging my hand along the brick buildings to ground myself. At one cafe, a man sat alone at a bistro table, no food in front of him. He caught my eye and began exaggeratedly raising his eyebrows and grinning, like we shared a secret joke. I felt uneasy and tried to ignore him, but every time I glanced back, he continued the strange display, his mouth stretching wider, his brows bouncing up and down like he was trying to make me laugh. In my child's mind, his face looked rubbery and unreal. In a blink, my parents had moved to the next restaurant, and I momentarily lost sight of them. Panic set in as the sea of adults swirled around me and car horns honked. When I looked back, the man was rising and heading toward me, weaving between outdoor tables with purpose. Without thinking, I darted into the throng, shoving past legs and chairs. My heart pounded as I scanned faces for my mother's red scarf. I found my family further down the block, near a souvenir cart. I didn't mention the man. Maybe I feared being scolded for wandering, or maybe I couldn't explain why he scared me. My father told me to hold his hand tighter. Years later, when I finally told my mother about the man, she grew quiet and squeezed my hand. She admitted that the city had always made her nervous too. She reminded me that no matter how embarrassing it feels, telling an adult about something unsettling is always the right decision. That conversation stuck with me. As a teenager, I traveled internationally and navigated bigger crowds, but I never forgot to keep my loved ones in sight and to trust the instinct that screams when a stranger's smile feels wrong. To this day, any time I lose sight of companions in a crowd, I remember his rubbery smile and wonder what might have happened if I'd hesitated even a moment longer. The world is full of people, but sometimes it just takes one unsettling gaze to make you feel completely alone. My freshman year of university was a crash course in adulthood. After a party one November night, I stayed over at a guy's place on the other side of town. In the morning, I ordered a rideshare back to campus. When the silver minivan arrived, the middle-aged driver insisted I sit up front because the back door was broken. I hesitated, but snow flurries were beginning to fall, and I didn't want to wait for another car. Harmless small talk soon turned personal. He asked where I was from, commented on my dress, called me pretty, and asked about my family. At a red light, he reached over without warning and placed his hand over mine on my lap, murmuring that my skin was soft. I froze, staring straight ahead, calculating the blocks left until we reached campus. He patted my hand like he was reassuring me, but his touch lingered too long. As we pulled up to the dorm courtyard, he asked for my number. When I refused, he smirked and said he'd find it in the app anyway. He leaned in to kiss me as if this were a date. I jerked away, bolted out of the car, and ran into my dorm, breathing hard and feeling stupid for not sitting in the back. I later reported him to the rideshare company. They suspended his account, but the experience lingered. For months, any small talk from male drivers made me flinch. I found myself riding with friends instead of alone, and I always chose the back seat, ready to bail if anything felt off. A friend later told me about an online forum where riders reported similar experiences. Reading post after post made me realize how common these boundary violations were and how rarely we reported them. It was both comforting and infuriating. The company sent me a generic apology and a coupon for a free ride, as if a discount could erase the feeling of his hand on mine. I talked to campus security and began sharing ride details with friends before I got into any car. It didn't matter what I wore or how polite I was. Predators only need opportunity. Looking back, I realize how quickly an ordinary morning can veer into danger and how important it is to trust the uneasy twist in your stomach. In the summer of 2014, my friend Ryan and I often spent evenings parked in the dimly lit lot of a 24-hour superstore, talking about life and listening to music with the windows down. It was our makeshift hangout spot away from parents and curfews. One warm night, a woman in her 40s approached our car, knocking on the window with tears in her eyes. She claimed her vehicle wouldn't start and begged us to walk with her to the far corner of the lot to help. She mentioned men hanging around and said she felt unsafe. Her hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and her voice quivered. We offered to follow her in our car so we could jumpstart hers. Her demeanor changed instantly. She climbed into our back seat uninvited and insisted we simply drive her there, referring to it once as our van before correcting herself. My skin prickled. Ryan and I shared a glance. We refused and instead drove toward the brightly lit store entrance where there were cameras. She scrambled out and, without thanking us, ran across the lot to a rusted white cargo van parked under a flickering light. As she neared, the side door slid open from the inside, and she dove in before it sped off. Back in our own driveways that night, we sat in stunned silence on the phone, replaying the encounter. In that moment, I realized danger doesn't always look menacing. Sometimes it comes in the form of a desperate-seeming stranger with a convincing story. If we hadn't trusted our instincts and insisted on our own safety plan, that night could have ended very differently. For weeks afterwards, I avoided parking lots and refused to roll my window down for anyone. That woman might have been coerced. She might have been part of a setup. I'll never know. What stays with me is the realization that your instinctive discomfort isn't rude. It's often the only barrier between you and whatever waits behind a sliding van door. By the time I turned 18, staying sober was my proudest achievement. I had started drinking young in a neighborhood where liquor was always within arm's reach. But with my parents' help and support groups, I had 2 years of sobriety under my belt. That meant joining adult meetings in a church basement at 7 in the morning before school. The chairs were metal, the coffee watery, but the stories were raw and honest. It was there that I met Derek, a lanky guy my age whose hair was always freshly washed and who wore button-up shirts like he'd come from work. After sessions, he would linger to talk while I scribbled in my journal, asking about my plans after high school and how long I intended to keep attending the group. When I mentioned I might switch to meetings closer to my new job, he looked crestfallen. One morning he asked if I wanted to get breakfast, but I declined politely. When my family planned a reunion in rural North Carolina, my brother Daniel and his wife needed a place to stay. Our grandmother's small mountain town had only one motel, so a neighbor of hers, Mark Ellison, offered his spare room. From the outside, his ranch house looked idyllic amid the rolling hills. A white porch swing creaked in the breeze and the flower beds were tidy. Inside, though, a heavy metallic stench hit us as soon as we crossed the threshold. Mark laughed it off, blaming his cats, and told us the room had been closed up for a while. What truly unsettled me were the locks. Shiny padlocks on interior doors and even on the sliding door of the guest room that Daniel and Sarah were to use. He said it was to keep his pets from wandering because of eagles and possums, yet we had just seen one of his cats outside. There were also hooks high on the walls, the kind you'd use for something heavy. Daniel and Sarah stayed there anyway, but avoided the house as much as possible, coming to our grandmother's cabin for meals and leaving only to sleep. 2 years later, during another visit, Mark apologized, unprompted, for how his house had smelled back then, and insisted I come see how clean it was now. I reluctantly agreed, curiosity and caution warring in my chest. The odor was gone, the carpets replaced, and the locks had been removed, but Mark watched me intently, almost hungrily, as I walked through the rooms. He seemed disappointed that I didn't linger in the basement. On a later visit, he repeatedly tried to coax my 8-year-old niece over to ride his exercise bike in the garage, assuring us it fit anyone and could adjust. Only when I pointedly told him she was too small and that we had plans did he drop it. My grandmother always insisted Mark was simply tidy and reclusive, but after she passed, I was relieved to never see him again. Sometimes the people you should fear aren't in the city but living just down the road, hiding their secrets behind tidy flower beds and forced smiles. It's easy to ignore a bad smell if someone tells you it's just the cats, but sometimes your nose knows when to stay away. Over the next few weeks of senior year chaos, I missed meetings, not thinking much of it. Derek showed up at my graduation, standing alone under a tree and handing me a gift bag with chocolates, a handwritten card saying I brightened the room, and a keychain with our meeting's motto. I felt uneasy, but thanked him. Soon after, he began appearing at the department store where I worked, circling my cosmetics counter and watching me without buying anything. He would ask my coworkers when I was scheduled. A no-nonsense coworker confronted him in front of customers, telling him to leave me alone. He turned red and scurried off, mumbling apologies. I never saw him again at the store. For months afterwards, I was jumpy walking home and found myself glancing over my shoulder when I saw folding chairs or styrofoam cups that reminded me of meetings. Sobriety gave me control of my life, but Derek's fixation reminded me how fragile that control really is. Even in spaces meant for healing, people can cross boundaries, and it's important to recognize when kindness crosses into obsession. When I first moved into my own place, a second-floor apartment in Riverton, I was proud of my independence. I decorated with thrifted furniture and potted plants, and savored the feeling of locking my own door at night. That changed one afternoon when a breathless stranger knocked on my door saying she'd seen a man trying to break into my car. Alarmed, I hurried outside with her to inspect. My car was untouched. She shrugged and said she wasn't sure where the man went and hurried off, disappearing down the stairs. The next morning, I noticed her sitting in a dark sedan at the far end of the parking lot. That evening, she parked again, staring toward my unit as I carried groceries. My coworker advised me to jot down her plate and call the police if she returned. Days later, at 1:30 in the morning, my doorknob rattled. Through the peephole, I saw the same woman. She didn't knock or speak. She just tested the handle and left when it didn't turn. A few nights after that, she and a man stood outside my door, whispering. I called the police while they jiggled the knob and scratched at the wood, telling me they only wanted to talk and needed my help with something. Sirens scared them off. The officers said people sometimes create a false sense of urgency, like a faked break-in to gain trust, and then strike when you let your guard down. They promised more patrols and told me never to open my door to strangers. I bought a door brace and started sleeping with my phone next to me. It's been weeks, and I haven't seen the woman again, but the memory of her smile as she asked if I lived alone still keeps me up at night. For the first time, the one place that should feel safest no longer does. Trusting my intuition over politeness might have saved me from something awful. I still live in that apartment, but my door stays locked, and so does my trust. At 16, I was insecure enough to fall hard for a guy I'd only known through Snapchat. Aaron showered me with late-night messages saying I was special and that he couldn't live without me. Those words were intoxicating to a teenager craving validation. Within a week, he demanded I drive an hour to his house. In person, he was charming at first, but he quickly became possessive, forbidding me from spending time with male friends and confessing casually that he might be a sociopath. He talked about getting into fights as if they were accomplishments. He cheated repeatedly, but whenever I confronted him, he cried and promised to do better, blaming his upbringing or his mental health. My own fear of abandonment kept me from leaving. I even proposed to him before he left for the Marines, using a pawn shop ring I bought with babysitting money. He said yes, then moved in with me and drained me emotionally and financially. He quit his job, borrowed my car, and spent my paychecks on video games and nights out. When he deployed, I discovered a hidden Instagram account filled with women he followed and direct messages he'd sent them. A joke he posted about cheating finally pushed me to end things and move his belongings back to his parents' house. For a few blissful weeks, he disappeared. Then the packages and texts started. He biked miles in the night to leave a notebook full of obsessive letters on my porch. The pages filled with declarations of love and rage, with drawings of our initials carved into hearts. From new numbers, he taunted me about enjoying life without him, threatened suicide to manipulate me, and admitted he had been watching my house. Blocking him and changing my phone number only led to handwritten letters mailed from other states with no return address. One note read, "You can change your locks, but not your address." The police could do little beyond documenting the harassment because he hadn't yet harmed me physically. I live in fear for myself and for the next girl he latches onto. My greatest hope now is for justice and for the strength to never again mistake control for love. The lesson I carry is that obsessive attention is not romance. It is a warning. My life had been defined by routine until a silver sedan started shadowing me on my drive home. I commuted the same route every day from the office to my suburban cul-de-sac, listening to podcasts and watching the sun set in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was coincidence, but day after day, the car with a blonde woman behind the wheel made every turn I made through my neighborhood, from the gas station to the final left onto Maple Lane. One evening I pulled over to let it pass, hoping to relieve the tension in my shoulders. The car slowed, then sped off as if testing me. The next time I pulled over, it stopped too. When I opened my door to confront the driver, the two rear doors swung open and two muscular men got out, staring at me silently from either side of the car like bodyguards. Fear slammed into me. I dove back into my car, slammed the door, and sped away as they scrambled back into their vehicle and gave chase for a block before turning off. Panicked, I called 911. The dispatcher told me to keep driving toward a public place and stay on the line. I met a patrol car outside a grocery store, but by then the sedan had vanished. A few days later, while walking my dog at dusk, I saw the two men strolling down my street like casual pedestrians. They never said a word. They just locked eyes with me and smirked. I turned and ran home, heart hammering. I never saw them again after that, but now every time I glance in the rearview mirror or catch a glimpse of a silver sedan, my stomach flips. Was it random? Were they mistaking me for someone else? It wasn't paranoia. Someone really was following me, and I may never know why. The not knowing is almost worse than a clear threat because it leaves you scanning crowds for faces that don't belong, wondering if a routine you've never questioned might be the very thing that puts you at risk. The summer after my freshman year, I was back living with my parents and working as a cashier at Value Mart. The job was monotonous, but I enjoyed the small talk with regulars. One afternoon, a man named Rick Saunders sent me a simple hi on Instagram. He looked to be in his 40s from his profile picture. I ignored him, chalking it up to a random stranger, but he continued messaging me with compliments and then sent me a Facebook request. When I blocked him there, he went through my public profile and liked and commented on photos from years ago, calling me beautiful and asking where I lived. Days later, he materialized at my register. Without buying anything, he asked why I kept blocking him and insisted he was just trying to get to know me. His voice was too familiar, like someone you'd seen in a dream. I told him to leave and informed my manager, who promised to call security if he returned. He did, wandering the aisles for half an hour, watching me ring up other customers. A week later, he was on my front porch knocking. I don't know how he found my address, maybe through a friend list, maybe from the store's name tag. I called 911 from my bedroom as he rattled the back door handle. Police officers arrived in time to arrest him as he tried to pry open a window. In his pocket were printed screenshots of my social media pages with my work schedule circled. A restraining order keeps him away now, but random messages and footsteps outside still make my heart race. It's frightening how easily an innocuous direct message can turn into a threat at your doorstep. I've since made all my accounts private and removed my location from posts. I never thought liking a photo or answering a polite DM could invite danger. But now I know that boundaries on the internet are just as important as the locks on your front door. In my early 20s, I took a receptionist job in a city and lived close enough to walk to work. During the day, the 15-minute stroll past coffee shops, art galleries, and corner stores felt safe and even enjoyable. I'd listen to music and watch commuters bustle by. At night, it was different. One Thursday around 11 after a late shift, I noticed a figure behind me, a man in a black hoodie with his head down. Each turn I made, he mirrored at a measured distance. I ducked down an alley and cut across a different street to lose him. He reappeared on the next block like he knew where I'd end up. A week later, the same hooded man trailed me again at a slightly earlier hour, staying just close enough for me to hear his boots on the pavement. That night, I received a call from an unknown number. The person on the line didn't speak. He just breathed slowly, the sound wet and deliberate. The calls continued at odd hours, always silence and breathing, even after I blocked the number. He switched to another number, repeating the cycle. I started taking cabs even when I couldn't afford them, and asked coworkers to walk with me to well-lit streets, but on the one night I walked again. He picked up his pace, and I heard his footsteps breaking into a run behind me as I cut through the alley. Instinct screamed, and I sprinted home, slammed the door, and listened as footfalls faded away. Soon after, I transferred to a job in another city and moved across town. The phone calls stopped. I never saw the man again, But to this day, when I walk alone after dark, I glance over my shoulder and feel my pulse quicken if I hear footsteps that don't belong to me. It's easy to convince yourself you're being dramatic until a breath on the phone proves someone is watching from the shadows. I bought a small house in Brookhaven and spent weekends tending a flower bed by the fence. The neighborhood was full of retirees and young families, and my biggest worry had been keeping the deer from eating my roses. One summer afternoon, I noticed a tall man in a baseball cap walk past. At first I thought he was just out for exercise, but he appeared again moments later from the other direction, and a third time after that, like he was pacing a boundary. A few days later, he stopped at the edge of my yard, stared, and asked abruptly whether I lived there. When I nodded, he said, "All right, bye," and left without introducing himself. After that, he walked by often, slowing to look at me while I watered or trimmed. Once I thought he raised his phone to take a picture, but when I stepped toward him, he tucked it away and smiled thinly. Part of me wanted to confront him. Part of me doubted my gut. Late one night, I awoke to the sound of breaking glass. Someone was trying to force my back window. I locked my bedroom door and whispered to the emergency operator, while heavy footsteps creaked across my living room floor and paused outside my room. The lock held as the doorknob twisted back and forth. Moments later, sirens blared, and the intruder fled. The police caught him in my yard, his baseball cap glinting under their flashlights. He wasn't a neighbor at all, but a man from another town several counties away. In his home, they found countless photos of me, some taken through my windows and others printed from social media posts, arranged like a shrine. He had been watching my routines, my gardening schedule, and waiting for a night when my curtains were open. I have since installed security cameras, reinforced my doors, and adopted a rescue dog whose bark makes me feel less alone, but nothing erases the memory of ignoring my instincts as he circled my house for weeks. If I hadn't trusted my gut and locked that door, I might not be alive to tell this story. Sometimes the most mundane routines are exactly what makes you vulnerable.